It was 2:47 in the morning when Trent Halsey made a decision that would either save his life or end it completely. Not his physical life. Something quieter than that. The kind of life that gets built up over years, the slow accumulation of a man's dignity, his reputation, his last remaining reason to believe he's still worth something. That kind of life. He was standing in the center bay of his father's old garage. Now technically his garage, though some months it barely felt like it. One bare bulb swinging gently overhead from a hook he'd never gotten around to replacing. Outside, November had decided to mean business. You could hear it pressing against the aluminum siding of the building, that low-pitched moan of cold wind finding every gap. His breath came out in small white clouds, even inside. His hands were black past the wrist with engine grease, and his knuckles had taken a beating from a socket wrench that slipped twice on the same stubborn bolt. In front of him sat the most beautiful machine he'd ever touched. A 1970 Plymouth Hemi Cuda, numbers matching. Original vitamin C orange paint, that specific, almost offensive shade of orange that Plymouth only used for 2 years before the world came to its senses. A car so rare that only 11 of them with this exact engine and color combination were confirmed to still exist in North America. The kind of car that made grown men stop breathing. And right now, that engine was dead. Not worn out dead, not neglect dead. Dead in a way that made Trent's stomach knot every time he thought about it, because he'd been staring at it for 6 hours now, and there was something about the way it had failed that didn't sit right with him. Something that nagged at the back of his mind like a word on the tip of your tongue that won't quite come. In 9 hours, Victor Crane, CEO of Crane Automotive Group, a man whose face appeared on billboards along I-71, grinning beside the slogan, "We drive you further," would walk through that garage door expecting 2 things, a dead engine and a signed damage assessment. What Trent was starting to suspect was that Victor Crane was expecting exactly one of those things. He just didn't know yet which one it was. If you've ever stayed up past midnight fighting for something that everybody else already gave up on, this story is for you. Stay right here, because what happens next, specifically what a 9-year-old boy does at 3 in the morning while his dad is covered in grease and running on fumes, is one of the most quietly extraordinary things we've ever had the privilege of telling on this channel. Like this video, subscribe to Crest Stories, and let's go back to the beginning. Trent Halsey grew up in a garage. Not metaphorically. His father, a man named Doug Halsey, who went by Doug to everyone except his own mother, ran a 2-bay service shop off Route 62 in Mill Haven, Ohio, a town so small that the Dairy Queen and the post office shared a parking lot, and everyone thought that was fine. Doug Halsey was the kind of mechanic that other mechanics came to when they were stumped. He had large, patient hands, a habit of humming old country songs without knowing he was doing it, and a philosophy about engines that he passed down to Trent the way other fathers passed down Bible verses. Every engine that won't run, Doug used to say, crouching beside an open hood with Trent at his elbow, is just an engine with a secret. Your job isn't to force it. Your job is to listen until it tells you. Trent was 38 years old now. His father had been gone 6 years. A heart attack on a Tuesday morning, quick and unceremonious. The kind of exit that felt wrong for a man who had lived so deliberately. The garage had passed to Trent, along with its modest equipment, its small but loyal customer base, and its complicated feelings. He'd kept the shop going. Some years better than others. His wife Karen had helped with the books, the scheduling, the subtle, slow human work of keeping customers loyal. She had a warmth that Trent, who was quiet and direct and sometimes forgot to smile, couldn't always manufacture on his own. She'd been the part of the business that made people want to come back, and she'd been the part of his life that made everything else feel worth the effort. Karen died on a Thursday in March, 2.5 years before the night of the CUDA. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed 8 months earlier. Those 8 months had been a long education in the distance between what insurance is supposed to cover and what it actually covers. By the time Trent buried his wife at Millhaven Memorial, he was carrying $94,000 in medical debt and raising a 9-year-old son named Danny entirely on his own. Danny. If you want to understand Trent Halsey, understand Danny first. Understand the way the kid ate breakfast. Always reading something, always with a pen nearby, even at the table, always with that slightly elsewhere expression that Karen used to say he got from her side of the family. Understand the way Danny watched his father work, not with the distracted half attention of a child who'd rather be somewhere else, but with a quiet, focused intensity that sometimes made Trent feel like he was being studied. Danny was 9, going on something significantly older. He had his mother's eyes. That specific gray-green that shifted depending on the light, and he had his grandfather, Doug's habit of going silent instead of speaking when something bothered him. He was the kind of kid who didn't ask a lot of questions out loud because he was busy working the answers out on his own. He also had a habit, which Trent had only recently discovered, of recording things on Trent's old phone when something felt important. We'll get back to that. The garage itself, Halsey's Service and Repair, a name Trent had never changed because it still felt true, sat on a half-acre of gravel on the eastern edge of town. 3 bays, one of which had a lift that squealed when you raised it above 8 feet. A small office where Trent kept the paperwork he was always behind on. A break room with a couch that had seen better decades and a mini-fridge that hummed too loud. His part-time employee, a retired postal worker named Lou Graber, who'd taken up auto mechanics in his 60s with the same energy most people reserved for much younger pursuits, worked Monday through Thursday, and kept everything from falling apart in the small logistical ways that Trent tended to miss. Lou had gone home at 5:30 that evening. "Call me if you need me," he'd said, pulling on his jacket, eyeing the car on the lift with the expression of a man who's seen enough to know when something is above his pay grade. The car had arrived that afternoon, and that arrival, the specific, almost theatrical way it came, is where this story really starts. Victor Crane did not come to Halsey's Service and Repair by choice. He came because his flatbed driver, a man named Pete, who worked for one of Crane's transport contractors, had been driving the CUDA from Cincinnati to a storage facility in Columbus when the truck needed fuel and Pete needed something else. Specifically, the men's room. And the nearest exit off I-71 happened to be the Millhaven exit, and the nearest building to that exit happened to be Trent's garage. That's it. That's the whole chain of coincidence. A man's bladder and a quarter tank of diesel. Pete pulled the flatbed into the lot and went inside, and Trent, who was under a 2019 Ram doing a routine oil change, heard gravel crunching and came out from under the truck to see what the commotion was. He saw the car. Even strapped to a flatbed, even not running, even with the hood slightly ajar from transport, the CUDA stopped him cold. He walked around it once without saying anything. Then he said, "Is that a Hemi?" Pete, who was already jogging toward the bathroom, said, "Yeah, boss says it's done. Engine seized. Just hauling it to storage." And Trent said, almost to himself, "Seized." He didn't say anything else. But he put his hand flat on the hood, and he stood there for a moment, and he had the expression of a man who has just been told something that doesn't quite add up. An hour later, Victor Crane called Pete's cell phone to check on the transport timeline, and Pete, who meant well and had a tendency toward casual conversation, mentioned that the mechanic at the stop had shown a lot of interest in the car, had asked some questions. Said he thought he might be able to look at it. The call that came to Trent's garage phone 2 minutes later was not warm. "Who am I speaking to?" The voice was the kind of confident that doesn't bother with pleasantries, because pleasantries are for people who aren't sure of themselves. "Trent Halsey. This is Halsey's Service and Repair." "Mr. Halsey." A pause, the way a man pauses who is used to people waiting for him. "I understand you've been expressing some interest in my vehicle. I asked your driver what was wrong with it. That's about all. My driver tells me you think you can fix it." Trent hadn't said that. He'd said it was interesting. There was a difference, but he didn't correct it. Instead, he said, "I'd like to look at it, if you've got a minute." Victor Crane had sent that car through 3 different shops in the past 10 days. His own dealership's master technician, a man with 30 years of experience and a wall full of certifications. A specialty muscle car restoration shop in Cincinnati that charged $400 an hour. A retired racing engine builder from Dayton who'd been quoted in car magazines. All 3 had said the same thing. The engine was seized beyond practical repair. The cost to restore it, if restoration was even possible, would exceed the car's insured value. It was, in the language of insurance assessors, a total loss. Victor had the paperwork started. The claim was with his adjuster, Mr. Halsey. "Halsey," Victor said, and there was something in his voice now. Not cruelty. Exactly. But the casual indifference of a man speaking to someone he's already categorized. 3 of the best engine men in Ohio have looked at that motor. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Not small-town shops. Professionals. Trent was quiet for a moment. Outside, he could see the CUDA still on the flatbed, orange as a lit match against the gray November sky. "I understand," he said. "Then I'm not sure what you think you can offer." "Maybe nothing," Trent said. "Give me 1 night." The pause that followed was the kind you get when a powerful man is deciding whether something is worth his amusement. Trent had heard that pause before, from different men in different contexts. It always felt the same, like being weighed. "1 night," Victor repeated. There was a sound on the line that might have been a short laugh. "And what exactly are you wagering, Mr. Halsey? What's the point of this?" "If I get it running," Trent said, "you pay my labor rate plus parts, and you don't file that total loss claim." Another pause, shorter this time. "And if you don't, I sign whatever assessment you need. Write it up the way you want it. Total loss, worthless engine, all of it." There was a longer silence. Trent could hear something in the background of Victor's end of the call. A TV, maybe, or music. Then Victor said, "Keep it overnight, Mr. Halsey. Pete can pick it up tomorrow morning. I'll be there at 8 to collect my paperwork." The line went dead. Trent stood holding the phone for a moment. Then he walked back outside to where the CUDA sat on the flatbed and asked Pete to bring it down. He didn't know, not yet, not consciously, that Victor Crane had already filed the insurance claim 2 days ago. But somewhere in the back of his mind, looking at that engine, he was beginning to wonder why a seized motor looked the way this one looked. Here's what you need to know about a seized engine. When an engine seizes naturally, from oil starvation, from overheating, from the slow accumulation of everything that goes wrong when a machine is neglected, it looks a specific way. There's scoring on the cylinder walls. There's discoloration from heat. There's evidence of what failed first, then second, then third, because mechanical failures have a sequence, and that sequence marks the way a story leaves clues. Trent had pulled seized engines apart before. He knew what they looked like. He knew the smell of them, that particular burnt metal smell that gets into your sinuses and stays there. This engine didn't smell right. He stood over the open hood. At 7 that evening, Danny doing homework at the workbench behind him, Lou long gone for the day. And he ran a flashlight slowly over every visible surface of the 426 cubic inch Hemi V8 that, according to everyone who'd looked at it, had given up the ghost. It was seized, yes. The crankshaft wouldn't turn. He'd confirmed that within the first 10 minutes. But the valve covers were clean. Not just clean, almost pristine, with the kind of surface that suggested regular, careful maintenance. The oil he'd drained from the pan was dark, but not contaminated. No metal flakes, no sludge, no sign of the slow internal deterioration that should have preceded a catastrophic seizure. He worked through the evening in the methodical way his father had taught him, starting from what he could see and moving toward what he couldn't. The temperature outside dropped. He found his old Carhartt jacket on the hook by the office door and put it on without stopping. Danny finished his homework and came to sit in the folding chair beside the center bay, the one that had always been the watching chair. Trent's name for it when Danny was small, when Karen was still alive, and the garage was a place the three of them spent Saturday mornings together. The boy sat with his knees drawn up and watched his dad work in silence for a while. "What's wrong with it?" Danny asked finally. "That's what I'm trying to find out. Does it feel like Grandpa's kind of problem or a regular kind of problem?" Trent paused. He looked at his son. "What do you mean by that?" Danny thought about it. Grandpa always said some problems were just broken things and some problems were hidden things. The hidden ones were the interesting ones. Trent looked back at the engine. "Hidden," he said quietly. "Yeah, maybe." He didn't say anything else for a while, but something shifted in the way he was approaching the engine. A slight change of angle, a recalibration of what he was looking for. Instead of searching for what had failed, he started searching for what shouldn't have been there. It took him another 2 hours. It was close to 10:30 when Danny, who had fallen asleep in the watching chair with his jacket as a blanket, stirred and mumbled something about being hungry. Trent heated up the leftover pasta from the fridge in the break room microwave, and they ate together at the workbench with the engine sitting 20 feet away. And Trent was quiet in the particular way he got quiet when his mind was running hard beneath the surface. "You should go to sleep," Trent told Danny after they ate. "School, tomorrow. Are you going to sleep? In a while." Danny looked at him with those gray-green eyes. "You're not going to sleep," he said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact from a boy who knew his father. "Go lay down on the couch," Trent said. "I'll wake you up before you need to leave." He watched Danny pad off toward the break room in his socks, jacket bundled under his arm. Then he turned back to the engine, and that was when he found it. The oil gallery. Every engine has them, those small drilled passages inside the block that carry oil under pressure to the moving parts that need it. On a high-performance engine like this Hemi, those galleries were precisely sized, precisely routed, the result of engineering that had been refined over decades. Oil pressure was everything. Without it, the bearings ran dry. Without the bearings, the crank seized. There are a few ways an oil gallery gets blocked. Sludge buildup from neglected oil changes, a failed oil pump, debris from a previous engine failure circulating through the system. What Trent was looking at was none of those things. He had removed the main oil gallery plug, a small threaded fitting that gave access to the primary oil passage, and he was shining his flashlight into the bore when he saw it. A small disc, round, precisely machined, sitting in the passage, with a fit so clean that it would have taken a trained eye and a specific reason to go looking to ever find it. He sat back on his stool. Outside, the wind pressed against the siding. The single bulb swung slightly. The Cuda sat in front of him, beautiful and orange, and full of a secret that 3 other mechanics had missed because they'd been looking for natural failure, not deliberate interference. Someone had blocked the oil gallery, not from neglect, not from a breakdown. Someone had manufactured a small disc. It looked like aluminum, machined to an exact tolerance, and placed it in the primary oil passage. When the engine ran, oil pressure built behind the disc. The bearings starved. The crank seized. From the outside, from any inspection all short of what Trent had just done, it looked like catastrophic oil failure. It looked, in other words, exactly like a total loss. Trent sat very still for a long time. He thought about the phone call from Victor Crane. He thought about the dismissiveness, the casual certainty that the engine was worthless. He thought about 3 master mechanics who'd looked at this car and said the same thing, and how strange it was that none of them had thought to look where Trent had looked, unless they'd been told specifically what they were looking for and specifically what they were not. He thought about the insurance claim that Victor had mentioned, casually, offhandedly, the way you mention something you expect to materialize. He tried to remember the exact phrasing. Not "I'll file a claim." Not "I'm filing." Something past tense, something already done. He picked up the disc and turned it over in his fingers. It was small, maybe the size of a quarter, smooth on both sides, no markings. He set it on the workbench. Then he picked up his flashlight and went back to work. The question that was eating at him now wasn't mechanical. He knew with a growing certainty that he could fix this engine. The disc came out. The passage was clear behind it. He'd need to flush the system, check the bearing surfaces for damage from however long the engine had run under oil starvation. Not long, judging by the minimal scoring. Reseat the main bearings if needed, reassemble, prime the system, and turn it over. It was work. Hard work. Precise work. The kind that took the better part of a night and every bit of focus he had. But it was possible. More than possible. The question was what it meant. If he was right, if that disc had been placed there deliberately, then the engine wasn't worthless. It never had been. It was a running, functioning, historically significant piece of American automotive history that had been staged to appear dead. For an insurance claim, and Victor Crane had sent it to Trent Halsey's shop expecting a signature confirming the lie. Trent worked. He tried to think it through clearly, the way his father used to approach a difficult diagnosis. Lay the possibilities out in a row, assign probability to each one, follow the most likely path, but keep your peripheral vision open for the others. Possibility 1, he was wrong. The disc was some kind of factory artifact, some bizarre original equipment he'd never encountered. That would make him look like an idiot in the morning, but it was a possibility. He turned the disc over again in his fingers. It wasn't factory. Nothing about it was factory. It was too precise and too purposeless to be anything but intentional. Possibility 2, someone other than Victor Crane had done this. A disgruntled employee, an enemy, someone with access to the car and a reason to destroy it. Maybe. He held that one lightly. Possibility 3, Victor Crane, or someone acting on his behalf, had deliberately disabled a car, worth somewhere between $2 and $3 million, in order to collect an insurance payout. and now he needed a mechanic to sign off that the engine was beyond repair. Trent set the disc back on the workbench. He started flushing the oil system. Not just. At some point, he'd lost careful track of time by then, but his phone said it was close to 1 in the morning. He heard the break room door open and shuffling footsteps, and Danny appeared at the edge of the center bay in his socks and the oversized Buckeyes sweatshirt he slept in, hair sideways from the couch cushion. "You're still up," Trent said. "Couldn't sleep." Danny sat down in the watching chair, pulling his knees up. "Did you find the secret?" Trent looked at his son. "What makes you say that?" "You have your quiet face on. The one you get when you're figuring something out, but it's making you feel weird." Trent almost smiled. "Go to sleep, bud. I'm not tired anymore." Danny looked at the engine, then back at his dad. "Is it going to be okay?" And Trent, who tried hard not to bring things home to Danny, who worked very deliberately to keep the financial worry and the exhaustion and the weight of the last 2.5 years away from his son's awareness, and who was not always successful, said, "I think so. Yeah." He meant the engine. But Danny, who was 9 years old and had been quietly watching his father carry more than a man should carry for longer than a boy should have to watch, tilted his head slightly and said, "And the other thing?" Trent looked at him. "What other thing?" Danny was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That man on the phone earlier, I heard you talking to him from the office. He didn't sound very nice." Trent didn't say anything. "Dad," Danny said, in the careful way he had when he was about to say something he'd been sitting on for a while. "Every time someone is mean to you and acts like you don't know anything, you let it go. You never do anything about it." Trent set down the flashlight. He looked at his son. "That's not. I know you do it because you don't want to make trouble," Danny said. "Mom used to say that about you too, that you were always trying not to make waves." He paused. "But she also said that the people who make waves are the ones who change things." The garage was very quiet. The wind had died down. The bulb barely moved. Trent picked the aluminum disc up off the workbench. He turned it over once. Then he set it in his shirt pocket. "Go get my phone," he said to Danny. "The old one. The one in my jacket in the office." Danny looked at him. "Why?" "Because," Trent said, "I want you to hold on to it tonight, okay? Keep it with you." Danny looked at his father for a long moment, that gray-green gaze that could occasionally make Trent feel like the kid was reading text that wasn't on his face. Then he nodded, stood up from the watching chair, and padded back toward the office. Trent turned back to the engine. He rolled up his sleeves, and he went to work the way Douglas Halsey had taught him. With patience, with precision, with the unshakable conviction that a thing worth doing was worth doing right, regardless of what time it was or who was waiting at the other end. The bearing surfaces had taken some damage. Not catastrophic, that's catastrophic. He'd caught it early enough that the scoring was minor, the kind of thing that could be addressed with careful cleaning and new bearing inserts rather than a full rebuild. He had the right inserts on the shelf, a small miracle of small shop inventory that he'd built up over years of buying carefully and never throwing anything away. His father's habit, inherited wholesale. He worked methodically through the night. At 2 in the morning, Lou's voice on his phone, he'd texted the old man at midnight, figuring Lou's insomnia would mean he was up. Came back with a string of questions, and then, "You sure about this?" Big claim to make about that car. Trent sent back, found a machined disc blocking the main oil gallery. Not a factory part, intentional. Lou's response took a few minutes, then, "Lord have mercy. Be careful, Trent." He checked on Danny at 2:30. The boy was curled on the break room couch, phone clutched in one hand. Asleep now, deeply. Stood in the doorway for a moment, listening to his son breathe, feeling the specific gratitude of a parent watching a child sleep, that combination of fierceness and tenderness that doesn't have a single word for it in English. Then he went back to the engine. The reassembly was the careful part. Every bolt torqued to spec, every passage verified clear. He used his compression tester, his oil pressure gauge. He ran through the checks in the order his father had taught him, in the order that could not be rushed without consequence. At 4:15 in the morning, he primed the oil system without starting the engine, a precaution to build pressure to the bearings before the first cold start. He watched the gauge. The needle climbed, held steady. He sat back on his stool. He rolled his shoulders, felt the knots along the back of his neck from 6 hours of bent-over work. His hands had stopped being cold around 2 a.m. and had moved into a comfortable numbness. He'd smell coffee that had been burning in the break room for hours. He stood up. He connected the battery. He looked at the car one more time, at that improbable orange, at the lines of something built in 1970 by people who couldn't have imagined it sitting in a garage in Millhaven, Ohio, in the care of a man who never asked for any of this, but was here anyway. He reached through the window, turned the key. The starter cranked. Once, twice, and then the 426 Hemi woke up. It didn't start tentatively. It didn't cough or hesitate, or offer the kind of preliminary noises a machine makes when it's unsure. It fired with an authority that vibrated the metal shelving on the far wall, that sent the hanging light swinging in a slow arc that rolled through the floor and up through Trent's boots and into his chest like a physical thing. The engine ran. Rough at first, as any engine that's been still runs rough. Oil pressure finding its passages, fuel system bleeding through. The 1,000 small systems that constitute a running engine remembering their jobs. But within 30 seconds it smoothed. Within a minute it was pulling a steady idle that a man who'd grown up beside engines could identify as right. Not just functional, but right. The way a correctly assembled thing sounds when it's doing what it was built to do. Trent stood beside the car with his hand on the roof and listened. He wasn't thinking about Victor Crane. He wasn't thinking about the disc in his shirt pocket or the insurance claim or the 8 a.m. appointment. He was just listening. The way his father had taught him. The way that had nothing to do with money or leverage or what happened next. He was just a mechanic, and the engine was running. He didn't hear Lou come in. Lou had gotten Trent's last text. It's running. And running. And driven over from his house 6 blocks away in his bathrobe, essentially, a coat thrown over it, showing up at 5:30 to the sound of that Hemi and standing in the open garage door with his coffee thermos and an expression that Trent only looked over to see once, but would remember for a long time afterward. It was the expression of a man who has witnessed something that confirms something he believed but was starting to doubt. "Your daddy would have loved this," Lou said. Trent didn't answer, but he nodded once, looking at the engine, and that was enough. They were in the break room when Victor Crane arrived at 8:03. Trent heard the car, the leased Mercedes SUV, Ohio plates, on the gravel, and he was already walking toward the center bay when the door opened. Victor Crane was taller than Trent had pictured from the voice. He was in his mid-50s, fit in the particular way that expensive gym memberships and decent jeans produced, wearing a wool overcoat that probably cost more than Trent's monthly shop revenue. He had the kind of face that photographed well on billboards, strong jaw, practiced smile, the kind of eyes that could be warm when warmth was useful. They were not warm right now. He stepped into the garage and stopped. His gaze went to the CUDA, which was sitting in the center bay, exactly where it had been when his flatbed driver left it the previous afternoon. Then he looked at Trent, who was standing by the workbench, and then at Lou, who was leaning against the far wall with his coffee thermos, watching. "Mr. Halsey," Victor said, and he said it the way a man says the name of an appointment he's come to conclude, not a conversation he's come to have. He had his phone in one hand and was already typing something. "I appreciate you looking at it. I know you had high hopes. If you have the assessment paperwork ready, we can." Trent reached through the CUDA's window and turned the key. The Hemi fired. It happened so quickly that Victor didn't have time to compose his reaction. It came off his face raw and unfiltered, and it wasn't what you'd expect. It wasn't surprise, exactly. It wasn't pleasure. It was something much colder. A flash of something that looked almost like alarm before the controlled affect came sliding back over it. His phone, which he'd been typing on, went still in his hand. The engine ran. Victor stood for a long moment, listening to it. Then he said, very evenly, "How?" "Found a blockage in the main oil gallery," Trent said. He reached into his shirt pocket and set the machine disk on the workbench between them. This was in the primary oil passage. Not a factory part. Machine to fit. Victor looked at the disk. His expression didn't change. "Interesting," he said. "The bearing surfaces had some scoring. Minor. I replaced the inserts from my stock. Flushed and primed the system before the first start." Trent paused. "Engine solid. Runs clean. You'll want a compression test to confirm, but I'd put money on it passing." Victor picked up the disk. He turned it over, the same way Trent had turned it over, 12 hours earlier. He set it back down. "What do you want?" Victor asked. The question landed with a flatness that had nothing to do with surprise. It was the question of a man who'd jumped to the end of the negotiation, who had already mapped the terrain. "What I said yesterday," Trent said. "Labor and parts. You cancel the total loss claim." Victor nodded slowly. His phone was in his hand again. He looked at it, then back at Trent. "That claim," he said carefully, "was filed some days ago. It's in process." "I figured," Trent said. "That creates a complication." "Yes, it does." Victor looked at him. This was a different kind of look from the billboard grin or the boardroom authority. This was the look of a man recalibrating, measuring the gap between where he thought he was and where he actually was. "Mr. Halsey," he said finally, "you're a capable mechanic. That's clear, and I respect capability." He said the word like it was a tool he was picking up. "Let me be straightforward with you. A claim in process has a momentum to it. Stopping it creates paperwork, questions. It draws attention to timelines." He let that sit for a moment. "I'd rather compensate you directly for your time and expertise," Victor continued, "and allow the existing process to proceed. I think that's cleaner for everyone." Another pause. "I can make it worth your while. I'm talking about real money, enough to make a meaningful difference to a shop like this." Trent was quiet. $50,000, Victor said, "deposited into whatever account you name, before noon today." Lou, from the far wall, made a sound that was not quite a word. Trent looked at the disk on the workbench. He thought about the debt. He thought about the second notice from the bank that was still sitting, opened but unanswered, on the desk in the office. He thought about $50,000 and what it would mean, actually, practically, month-to-month mean, to him and Danny. And then he thought about Danny saying, "Every time someone is mean to you and acts like you don't know anything, you let it go." He thought about Karen saying, "The people who make waves are the ones who change things." "I appreciate the offer," Trent said. Victor's posture shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly. the loosening of a man who believes he's about to land. But no, Trent said. The loosening stopped. You need to think carefully, Victor said, and the warmth that had been in his voice, the performance of warmth, was gone now entirely. I know some people in this county. I know the building inspector for this district. I know the tax assessor's office. A shop like this, in a building this old. He glanced around the garage in the way a man glances at something he's about to describe as beneath him. I'd imagine there's a list of items that might require attention, compliance issues, back assessments that could come due. He was very still as he said it. His voice had not risen. He was the kind of man who'd learned long ago that threats delivered quietly were more effective than threats delivered loudly. Trent said nothing. Think about your son, Victor said, and that specific sentence was a mistake.
Because in the break room, the door of which was 3 inches ajar, Danny Halsey, who was supposed to be getting ready for school, who had been awake since 5:30, who had watched his father through a crack in the door, listening to the engine fire with an expression that nobody there saw, had been doing something with his father's old phone for the last 6 minutes.
He'd been doing it since he heard Victor Crane's pull into the lot. He'd started it when the man with the wool coat walked in and immediately began speaking to his dad, and the tone that Danny knew from experience meant the kind of conversation his father would be upset about later and would never fully explain and would chalk up to how some people are. Danny had watched enough and waited enough and been told not enough to have made a quiet decision somewhere around 2 in the morning, somewhere between pretending to be asleep on the break room couch and listening to his father work and thinking about his mom and thinking about his grandfather and thinking about the kind of man he wanted to become, which was the kind of man his father already was, only maybe a version who made some waves sometimes. The old phone was recording. It had been recording since Victor Crane walked through the door. Later, when the investigator from the Ohio Department of Insurance Fraud Division pieced the timeline together, what she found was this. Victor Crane had owned the 1970 Plymouth Hemi Cuda for 11 years. He'd acquired it at auction, had it restored, and carried it on a specialty vehicle policy with an agreed value of $3.2 million. He'd never driven it. It lived in climate-controlled storage and appreciated steadily, which was the point. 14 months before the night of the garage, Victor's company, Crane Automotive Group, had entered a financing arrangement that went sideways. A bad commercial real estate acquisition, the kind of deal that looks inevitable going in and catastrophic coming out. He needed liquidity, fast, quiet liquidity, the kind that didn't require selling assets at a public auction that would attract attention and questions. The CUDA was insured for $3.2 million. If it were a total loss, the claim would pay out without public scrutiny, without a sale, without the kind of attention that a motivated investor or creditor might find interesting. So Victor Crane had hired someone, not a mechanic, not someone with any visible connection to the shop or the car, just a man who was good with precise work and better at not existing, to make the engine stop running in a way that would look like catastrophic failure. Machined dister, the perfect fit, the designed death of a machine that still had decades of life in it. He'd sent the car to 3 different shops for assessments, carefully selected. Shops that were reputable enough for the insurance company's requirements, but not the kind of shops that would pull an oil gallery plug and go looking in the dark with a flashlight because something in the failure pattern didn't sit right. He had not counted on a flatbed driver with a small bladder and an exit ramp. He had not counted on Trent Halsey and he had absolutely not counted on Danny. The recording was 47 seconds long. It wasn't high quality. The old phone's microphone, muffled by a break room door, caught everything at a slight remove. But it was clear enough. Victor's voice, measured and precise. The offer of $50,000. The reference to the claim already being in process. The mention of the building inspector. The tax assessor. Think about your son. Lou Graber, who had been leaning against the far wall and saying nothing through the entire exchange, walked across the garage after Victor Crane left. Walked slowly, the way Lou moved when he was making sure his bad knee didn't complain. He stood beside Trent for a moment, looking at the Cuda's engine. "Well," Lou said. "Yeah," said Trent. "What are you going to do?" Trent looked at the disc on the workbench. He looked at the engine. He looked at the break room door, where Danny had come out and was standing in the doorway in his Buckeyes sweatshirt, holding the old phone, watching his father. Trent walked over to his son. He crouched down, so he was at Danny's level, the way he'd done since Danny was small, the way that said, "I'm talking to you, not at you." He looked at his son's face. Those gray-green eyes, Karen's eyes, watching him with the specific calm of a child who has thought something through and is ready for whatever comes next. "You recorded it," Trent said. "Yes, all of it. Yes, from the beginning." Since he walked in, Danny paused. "You told me to hold the phone, I thought." He stopped. Then, "Was that okay?" Trent looked at his son for a long moment. The garage was quiet except for the Hemi ticking as it cooled. Outside, November was doing its thing. The gravel lot was empty now. Victor Crane's Mercedes long gone. "It was more than okay," Trent said. He hugged his son. Not the kind of hug you give to comfort someone, but the kind you give when you've been standing at the edge of something dark, and you reach out for the thing that reminds you why you're standing at all. Danny hugged him back with all the force of a 9-year-old who'd been staying up all night waiting to know if it was going to be all right. Lou turned away and found something on the far shelf that needed his attention very intently for the next 45 seconds. What happened after that moved faster than things usually move in a town like Millhaven. Trent called a lawyer, not someone local. A friend of his cousin's in Columbus, a woman named Patricia who did civil litigation and had a reputation for not being easily impressed by men in expensive overcoats. He sent her the recording. She called him back within an hour, and he could hear the specific quality in her voice that lawyers get when they've just looked at something that has significant implications. A kind of restrained, professional excitement underneath the careful language. "Don't move the car," she said. "Don't clean anything. Take photographs of everything in situ. That disc goes into a sealed bag. And don't talk to him again without me on the line." The Ohio Department of Insurance was the next call that afternoon. Fraud investigations were not fast things normally, but the combination of the recording, the physical evidence, and paper trail of 3 engineering assessments that Victor had apparently guided toward a predetermined conclusion gave the investigators enough to work with quickly. The claim, which had indeed been filed 2 days before Trent received the car, was flagged and suspended pending investigation within 4 business days. Victor Crane retained 2 attorneys and issued a statement through them that included several uses of the phrase "complete mischaracterization." His billboard on I-71, the one with the grin and "We drive you further," came down for maintenance around that time and was not replaced for quite a while. The story made the local news first, then the Columbus Dispatch, then picked up by a wire service because, as one editor apparently noted, it had everything. A single dad, a rare car, a secret hidden inside an engine, and a powerful man who'd underestimated exactly the wrong person. Trent's phone started ringing, not from reporters, or not only from reporters, from other people, car owners, restoration specialists, collectors who'd heard about the shop in Millhaven where a mechanic had found what everyone else missed, from a vintage car museum in Indiana that had a 1968 Hemi Roadrunner with an engine they hadn't been able to get right, from a family in western Ohio with a 1969 Dodge Charger that had sat in a barn for 30 years and hadn't run since Reagan was president. Lou added a Tuesday to his schedule and then a Friday. Trent hired a second part-time employee, a 23-year-old named Kevin who'd been doing oil changes at the dealership down the highway and wanted to actually learn engines. The garage grew, not overnight, the way stories sometimes pretend things grow. It grew over months, slowly, with setbacks and complications, and at least 1 week in February where Trent sat in the office looking at the numbers and felt the old, familiar clench of not quite enough. But it grew, steadily. The way things grow when they're built on a foundation that was always solid, just not visible yet. The CUDA itself became the center of a civil proceeding that would take almost 2 years to fully resolve. The insurance company, which had been defrauded or very nearly defrauded and had their own opinions about that, became a co-plaintiff. Victor Crane's attorneys settled rather than going to trial, because going to trial would have required explaining the machine disk, the timeline, the recorded conversation, and the specific sequence of professional assessments that had been gathered in a manner that would not photograph well before a jury. The car went to auction eventually. As part of the asset liquidation that followed, Crane Automotive Group's collapse under the financial weight of what had been a house of cards for longer than most people knew. It sold for $2.9 million. The buyer was a collector from Nashville who made a point of contacting Trent's shop afterward to say that he'd heard the story, that he knew the engine had been rebuilt by the man in Millhaven, and that he'd had the car inspected before the auction by 3 different specialists, all of whom had confirmed the rebuild was impeccable. He asked Trent if he'd ever consider looking at a 1970 Boss 429 Mustang that had been giving everyone fits. Trent said he'd take a look. There is a picture that Danny drew about 3 weeks after all of this, for a school assignment where the kids were supposed to draw something they were proud of. Most of the kids drew sports trophies or birthday parties. Danny drew a garage, a single overhead light on a hook, a car that was very clearly orange, a man bent over an open hood, a flashlight in his hand, and, standing beside the man, holding something small, a phone, a smaller figure with sideways hair. His teacher asked him about it, and Danny said, "That's my dad fixing something that was broken, and that's me helping." The teacher, who had heard some version of the story through the local news and through the particular osmosis of small-town information, wrote at the bottom of the picture, "Excellent work. This is a story worth telling." She was not wrong. Here is what Trent Halsey will tell you if you ask him about that night, and people do ask, because the story has a way of following him now, quietly, like a good reputation tends to do. He'll tell you that the most important moment wasn't when the engine fired. It wasn't when Victor Crane walked in. It wasn't the recording, or the lawyers, or the insurance investigators, or any of the things that came after. He'll tell you the most important moment was around 3 in the morning, when a 9-year-old boy with sideways hair and his mother's eyes sat in a folding chair in a cold Ohio garage and told his father something that Karen had said. The people who make waves are the ones who change things. And Trent will tell you that he didn't change anything, Particularly, he fixed an engine. He was honest about what he found. He let his son hold a phone. But the other thing he'll tell you, and this is the part that's harder to say, that requires the quiet and the lack of eye contact that means a man is telling you something true, is that for the 2.5 years between Karen's death and that night, he'd been operating in a kind of low-level survival mode, getting through, keeping the shop alive, keeping Danny fed and schooled and stable, keeping the grief at a manageable distance, not making waves, not asking for more than what came to him, and he'd told himself that was strength. But what Danny said, and what Karen had said before Danny, was that there's a difference between patience and surrender. And somewhere in the silence of 3 in the morning, with an engine in front of him and a son, behind him, and a disc in his pocket that someone powerful needed him to not understand, Trent Halsey had found that difference and stepped across it. That's it. That's the whole thing. A man who listened until the engine told him its secret. A boy who watched his father and decided not to let the secret stop there. A garage in Millhaven, Ohio, that smelled like oil and cold metal, and the particular stubbornness of people who do right things for no better reason than that they are right. The engine ran. Everything else followed from that. If this story landed somewhere in you, if it hit the part of you that knows what it feels like to be unautomated, to be standing over something broken at an impossible hour with no guarantee of anything, and keep going anyway, we'd love to know. Leave a comment below. Tell us about a time you proved something to someone who wrote you off. Subscribe to Crest Stories if you haven't already. We find stories like this one, real, human, true, in all the ways that matter, and we bring them here. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. And one last thing, tell a single parent you know that they're doing great. Not because it changes the physics of what they're carrying, just because it's true, and true things deserve to be said. Until next time.